because I don't like looking at it. Good morning, good afternoon. Before starting my speech, I want to first of all send my love and care for our colleagues in Ukraine and to those colleagues who have family in Ukraine. The situation is unfathomable, but I hope that you're all managing to keep safe. It reminded me of when I was in high school on the morning of September 11, waking up to the incredulous images of buildings on fire in the heart of Manhattan. And I believe the recent events are even more significant for the world than 9/11. I don't believe there's been an event of that nature since the war in Bosnia, and even that would hardly be comparing apples to apples. Well, with that said, we couldn't have picked a more contrasting subject for this month's practice, fashion. Now, over the last 2 years or so, if you're like me, there's been one category of apparel that probably got a bit more use than all the other ones, and that is sleepwear. My usual toiling from dusk to dawn was made that much more bearable thanks to the fact that I was able to work in my PJs, at least the bottom half. I had a healthy assortment of flowy bell-bottoms, oversized shirts, matching sets, loungy pants, flannel PJs, and so on a weekly rotation to help me get through the pandemic. And in fact, I wasn't alone in that pursuit. Worldwide sales of pajamas more than doubled in 2020 compared to 2019. I haven't checked the numbers for 2021, but I believe the trend is on the up and up. And it was reported that the fastest growing category of apparel clothing was in fact sleepwear in the last 2 years. So just to put that in context, sales of pajamas more than doubled, as I mentioned. The sleepwear market size was, I think this is global market, was valued at 10.49 million in 2019, and it's projected to reach 18.69 million by 2027. So in a short few years, it's projected to reach a CAGR of 9.7%. All right, the pandemic, as isolating as it was, did give us a glimpse into people's homes or their living rooms. And we were able to see our colleagues in their intimate setting. So I became curious about some of the origins of what people wore in their most intimate setting, that is the bedroom. So that's when I started looking into the subject of sleepwear, and allow me to now take you through a voyage of sleepwear's history through time. So as I mentioned, pajamas were generally considered to be a private matter. And any form of sleepwear was meant only for the eyes of the wearer and their family. So because of this, we don't have many examples or historical records of what people wore when they went to sleep. But fortunately, there's many cues and clues that we can pick up, and we can try to paint a picture of what that might have looked like. Going back to medieval times, around the 14th century, it would seem, according to medieval records, that in Portugal, people just slept naked, no need of clothing. Of course, this was a luxury because to sleep naked, it means that you didn't need the protection and warmth of clothing. So I believe that was only for nobles. Where they had plenty of blankets and they had properly heated homes. But I believe that people of lower standing might have slept with their clothes on just because it's keeping them warmer. And the word pajama actually comes from a Hindi word. And they were loose pants. They were loose, comfortable pants meant to obviously protect the wearer's modesty while keeping them warm. And it dates back from the Ottoman Empire. So the word was pajama in Hindi. Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. So there were these wide fit trousers that you could fasten with a tie string at the waist. And these were popular both for men and women all throughout the Middle East, South Asia, including Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, and southern India. That was from the East. And in the Western world, they were introduced about in about 1870, when, of course, British colonials coming back from that region adopted them as an alternative to the traditional European nightshirt or nightgown, which was a big piece of fabric that just draped them. So the British actually introduced pajamas to the West. And then there was one event that really, I guess, changed the market for pajamas, and that was the creation of the sewing machine. So up until 18th century, people were making their own clothes. So there was no ready to wear. We don't go to a shop to buy pajamas, obviously. Therefore, the pajamas were more simple. It was just, like I said, a long piece of cloth that you just drape over your body. But then with the sewing machine, in the West, at least, they went from creating their own clothes to purchasing ready to wear from a store. And that concept didn't exist before. And then over the next 200 years from that point on, the styles of the most popular pajamas were dictated by what culture of the time viewed to be right or wrong, normal or not, moral, immoral. As an example, in the Victorian era, obviously was a very conservative time, especially for women. So women would be covered from neck to feet, from day to night, and the pajama trends reflected that. Let me just do a quick time check. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the difference of what men wear and what women wear. Did you know that the word nightgown, or the concept of a nightgown, was actually popularized by men? And men started adding styling elements to their pajamas long before women did. So they would add laces and trimmings, whereas women kept their nightgown quite simple, plain, and shapeless. So the traditional men's nightgown resembled a Japanese kimono. So it would be a loose coat that hangs, and then you would fasten it at the waist. And then the nightgowns for women only started to be a bit more fashionable in the late 19th century. And they were initially cut from men's style. One theory that explains it is that the Western society at the time was really patriarchal. So men would set the trends and women would follow or adapt. And also, if you know a bit of history, many were afraid to appear to be voicing women's rights, or they didn't want to seem like they joined the growing women's suffrage movement. You may have heard of the suffragette. I'm sorry, I didn't give you this word, but hopefully you've heard of this before. So the suffragette was between the 1800s to early 1900s, but I think the movement only made a breakthrough in 1918, so the beginning of the 19th century. Yeah, so women's suffrage is a relatively new phenomenon, as you know. Okay, so fast forward to the 20th century. We're getting closer to modern times. That's really when pajamas became fashion. By 1902, men's pajamas widely available. They were quite fashionable, and they started experimenting with different fabrics. So instead of just being a plain cotton, they use madras, mispronouncing that, flannel, and they were no longer exotic, no longer from India. It was just commonplace to wear a pajama to sleep. and they were considered quite modern, and you could even wear them to go for dinner at a friend's house, for example. And now in 1920, I don't know if that, for those of you who know fashion, the 20s are associated with, of course, the one and only Coco Chanel. She was the first designer to create attractive and elegant pajamas for women. So the 20s is, of course, characterized by streamlined, androgynous fashions, as you know, like the Chanel look. But she even made something called the beach pajama. So these were meant to be worn seaside as you take a stroll, as you walk on the boardwalks, and the more avant-garde women would follow in Chanel's footsteps and wear that to go take a walk. So by the end of that decade, pajamas were accepted as normal dress for the average woman. And evening pajamas were even intended to be worn as a kind of costume at home. And you could have dinner with your family. It wasn't just for sleep. And that trend of wearing pajamas out, not just for sleeping, made a comeback in the 30s and then in the 60s, and I would argue in modern times, where you see Gen Zs, we just talked about them, strolling the streets in those like matching sets, and you're wondering, did they just come out from a yoga class, or that's just their everyday wear? So it's making a comeback, quite popular. When you think of pajamas for women, you may think of these nighties, or how do you call them? These more fancy, sexier, shorter dresses. And that was only a trend that began in the 40s. So there were these baby doll cut fabric in different, it could be in lace or other fabrics. And the reason they became sexified, let's say, is because of Hollywood. So there was that whole glamour associated with making the pajama more and more revealing and more sexy. And of course, with the advent of brands such as Victoria's Secret, this whole industry just took a whole other dimension. Okay, well, I hope that gave you a taste of what people wore in their bedrooms and in the evenings. And you may wonder, what's the sleepwear of the future? Are we going to go back to medieval trends of sleeping in the nude? Or are we going to be wearing, I don't know, the same clothing from day to night? Whatever it is, I think sleepwear is a very interesting topic. And I just want to leave you with a last trend that I think should make a comeback, which is sleeping caps. They seem quite dorky if you think about it, but the idea is to protect women's hair during the night because there's a lot of friction. So if you made a hairdo, you could wrap it in a sleeping cap, and you wake up in the morning, your hair stays the same. So I think that's a really pragmatic advantage of wearing a sleeping cap, sorry. So I think my next late night foray down the Wikipedia rabbit hole would perhaps be about women's hair trends over the years. Thank you.